Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks BSides Rochester. Quick show of hands. I did a talk last year at BSides Rochester, very similarly themed, called Enterprise Class Vulnerability Management Like a Boss. Anybody sit in on that? One. Cool. So the first couple of slides might be, look at you. First couple of slides might be a little bit repetitive, just going over kind of why we're here, and then basically content about enterprise security architecture and what it does. So real quick, I'm Rocky. I've been doing this a long time. I also organize BSides Cleveland, which is coming up in June. I pen test, I do risk assessment, enterprise security architecture. We do a lot of purple team stuff. So our attacking knowledge kind of like, gets distributed over to the blue teams looking for, really specific advanced adversary type tactics. And this is really kind of a byproduct of what some of the stuff that I've been working on with our clients over the last couple of years at this point. And so from a history lesson perspective, in 2007, this guy here, Gunnar Peterson, who's really smart, so look him up. He and the organization that he was with at the time put together this paper called Security Architecture Blueprint. Now, for a security, we all know what Moore's Law is, right? So for a security document to be as relative as it is today, almost 10 years ago, that says something. This is just kind of an illustration of where we are today, and there's some problems going on, right? The information is beautiful, .net site, world's biggest data breaches. We updated this, or they updated it very recently, so now we've got even the voter database breach, which ended up being giant. The other side of the slide, on the right-hand side of the slide, the top is 2007 to 2014, Gartner's IT spend globally in trillions of dollars. Okay, so for the most part, a pretty nice big uptick. Below that is the Verizon data breach report from 2008 to 2014, and for the most part, kind of still an uptick. So that tells me that there's something wrong. We're spending a lot of money and we're still getting breached, right? The way I really, did you have a question? Or?
Yeah, I was just curious.
Yeah, sure.
I always see those and I always think, is it because they're spending so much money that detection's better, that we're finding the breaches now than we weren't before?
No. We're spending more money and we're continuing to get breached more. Right?
Usually you're actually finding them versus you wouldn't even know they existed.
Reporting, yeah. I mean, that absolutely could have, that could skew the numbers in, some way, shape, or form. Absolutely. But realistically, from my perspective and having been doing this a couple of decades, organizations really understand that protecting business critical data is crucial to the business, right? But they're typically looking at it from two ways, and both of those ways are really kind of flawed fundamentally. The first is from a project-by-project basis, right? We need a new firewall. We need to upgrade the VPNs, et cetera. There's no business need. There's no strategy behind any of that stuff. It's just, okay, we're kind of, this is the natural course of our professional lives, right? The other way is from a compliance perspective, right? Organizations are basing their security programs on compliance, which on one hand does kind of make sense, because if you are found in not compliant with some type of regulatory mandate, what happens?
You lose the ability of that client that...
Say that again?
I said you lose the ability to deal with that agency or that client or that
Sure.
income stream.
Sure. All right. So this gentleman right here said you lose the ability to work with, let's say the organizations that require you to be compliant, et cetera. That's absolutely true. That is a business impact. The second business impact is somebody back there said fines. Thank you. Right. So we have that it does kind of make sense that organizations are basing their security programs around compliance because there are business impacts, but all the security nerds like me have historically said this for years at this point, right? And beating a dead horse, I can't believe I'm going to have to drink just saying it. If you're compliant, you're probably not secure. But if you're secure, you're also going to be compliant to whatever framework you have to be compliant with, right? So, again, this is really just kind of history of before we actually get into the threat management portion of this, right? Complexity, enterprises are complex, and you therefore, to solve the complexity issue, not just with information security, but complexity in general of organizations, of businesses, right? We need some type of architecture, right? And that's where the enterprise security architecture concept comes into play in relation to enterprise security and protecting business critical data, right? We can break it down very simply, right? We need to have organizational goals. We need to understand and take into consideration the environment where these systems are being built, okay? And then the technical capabilities required to build and operate those systems. That's architecture at its most broken down, right? And the idea is to organize complexity, right? Again, I'm sure everybody in here has also heard the phrase, if the more complex a system is, anyone? Thank you, right? The less secure it is. So we need to really rely on architecture to organize the complexity of large enterprises, right? Benefits, you can read, but again, one of the things that I am going to focus on here is one of the areas that most organizations just fail miserably at, and that's metrics, right? But that's really important because that's how we, on the technical, whether it's IT or IS, right? Whether you're in system administration or actual security roles within your organization, that's how we communicate back up into the business, right? Our business leaders, the CIO, should not be the technical experts. You can argue that, right? But typically are not going to be the technical experts to understand exactly what you're trying to tell them because you're the technical expert, right? And so we need to really get better at communicating back into the business via metrics. So at its basic kind of form, right? This is the overarching blueprint laid out by that 2007 paper by Gunnar Peterson, and his associates. And again, this is so relevant, right? Understand the stakeholder goals, and now within the enterprise security architecture, we have risk management, policy and standards, and actual design and security architecture. Those three pillars are supported by process, defense in depth, and metrics. On the process side of the house, you have SDLC, right? So application lifecycle, et cetera. You have identity management, vulnerability management, and threat management. Defense in depth is typically what we consider, what we normally are talking about when we talk security, right? These are the firewalls, this is the antivirus, this is everything, that all your controls, that's your defense in depth, right? And then I already talked about metrics, which we're awful at. So this talk is specifically on threat management, right? And so what does threat management mean? So we're breaking this down into typical components, including your controls and your logging sources, monitoring, threat modeling, right? Incident response, and then, don't shoot me, threat intelligence. Again, that's getting one of another example of a silly buzzword that. Does anybody know who Norse is? Okay, so there's a lot of laughs. Good, you know where I'm talking about. Okay, so here we go. Right, this is the threat management process of the enterprise security architecture. Now, what are the challenges here? I already brought up Moore's law, right, and that applies to malware, right? So already, for the most part, the blue teamers are historically always going to be behind the curve, right? Just based on Moore's law, right? But we have, excuse me. So the challenges around intelligence, right? So effectively knowing, having knowledge of those latest types of attacks and trends. Communication, right? When you get into enterprise incident response, all right, your organization is more than likely, if, you know, and again, I'm talking enterprise, you know, level, large organizations, broken up into many business units, okay? So if there is a breach somewhere, that is going to affect multiple business units. How are you communicating throughout your organization to the right people who are accountable for them responding accordingly and collectively contributing to the incident response program, right? So communication is a giant, giant problem. Coordination is really, you know, the next step and the next challenge there. Accountability, you know, I already talked about metrics. And talent, right? The security economics talk earlier this morning was talking about, you know, the zero unemployment. I've heard negative unemployment in the information security, you know, community. Actually, that's just, you know, across industries, right? But specifically with information security, negative unemployment. I don't know the numbers, but based on how, you know, how hard it is that I've seen to actually attract and keep awesome talent, I believe it. Right? I don't think that that's not, you know, not true. What was that?
So there's a lot of mediocre talent out there.
You're going to have that, right? You're going to have that because. I mean, I've been doing this 23, 24 years. Not everybody in here has, right? And I sucked at some point. You know, I'm also that statement also assumes that I'm good now. So I'm. that could be just my subjective, you know, view of my own security talent. But so one of these other more important things that we need to deal with here is. I read a report. It was kind of funny. I just kind of came across this report as a Sensage, S-E-N-S-A-G-E, 2012 report that showed that the massive and mostly manual efforts of collecting and analyzing security data has caused a severe downturn in both the mood of security teams as well as the perception of their effectiveness by stakeholders. Now, I'd cite that report, but it's a dead link. Somebody wrote that report and then reviewed it and made that comment, which I thought was hilarious and probably very, very scarily true. But there's no link. So anyway.
Way back.
Yeah, way back, Gene. It was last night. That entire process. I mean, this immediately came to mind. Right? I've seen things you people wouldn't believe, and if anybody doesn't know that movie, there's the door. Right? Okay, so moving on to threat management goals. All right, here's what we want to try to accomplish within a mature threat management process for our enterprise security architecture. We want improved intelligence for quicker decision making. A lot of this is really kind of, you know, duh. But, you know, buy-in from all service owners and stakeholders is critical, especially when we get into incident response, right? Integration of an existing vulnerability management process, because the two are really aligned in ways that, you know, you can't just rely on a mature vulnerability management or a mature threat management process. You really need to have these two aligned and maturing as you are growing your enterprise security architecture. Improved detection and reaction times, right? You know, this is that specific characteristic of this is really why most good penetration testing teams are moving towards that hybrid model, right? That purple team testing, where the red team is the attacking team and the blue team is the defender team, but the engagements are really more of a hybrid. The blue team is watching the red team as they're attacking, right? The creative juices start to flow. They begin to see advanced tactics that they may not have ever, you know, considered or may not have ever seen, and are really starting to think about, well, how can I detect that better? Or how can I react to that better, right? So this type of hybrid model is really geared towards improving the detection and reaction times. Excuse me. Threat prioritization. Okay, so for example, and I'll kind of get into this in detail, but you know, if you have a malware outbreak and it's affecting 8 people, so far that you know about. But one of those people happens to be your senior R&D guy. And if his machine and everything that he can access is breached, that poses a significant risk to the organization for the theft of intellectual property. But it's only 8 instances within, let's say, a 10,000 staffed enterprise. How do you prioritize that? Right? So there needs to be a threat prioritization model and standard as a part of the threat management process itself. Incident response maturity, and then service owner and stakeholder reporting with the metrics. So here's a couple of years ago when I started thinking about this. Is anybody familiar with the OWASP Application Security Verification Standard? A couple people, okay. The latest version, the 2014, and we're now at version 3, okay. The ASVS 2014, this is a model for SDLC, okay, Software Development Lifecycle. And I'll go through this really quickly, but as opposed to the OWASP Top 20, ASVS is actually implementable. The OWASP Top 20 tends to be just muddled, you know, I won't get into it. So at the very, this is going to be the ASVS, a very, very high level overview of what it is in relation to what it was originally intended to be, which is a software development lifecycle kind of process or set of processes. And what we're going to do is then apply this model to threat management. This is what I did last year when I applied this model to vulnerability management, and it seemed to work pretty well. And so I was like, well, maybe I can reduce the amount of time I needed to create a new presentation and just apply this to threat management. So that's what I did. Level 0 in the ASVS is really, there's not a lot going on, or there's nothing structured within the organization. We're actually not going to focus on that whatsoever. All right, that's just okay. You're going on, right? Level 1 is called opportunistic. From an application perspective, that means that the application can adequately defend itself against application security vulnerabilities that are easy to discover. Okay. So at a high level, we'll just kind of leave it at that. Level 2 is standard, right? The application can adequately defend itself against prevalent application security vulnerabilities of moderate to serious risk. Okay, great. So we're beginning to develop some type of scale that we can grade against, right? Now, I hesitate to say audit. It's kind of an audit, but it's a really, really detailed audit, right? This is not, do you scan for vulnerabilities? This is, how mature is your vulnerability management process? And we're going to be grading against this at this level 1, level 2, and level 3 for your threat management programs. Level 3, the application can adequately defend itself against all advanced application security, and again, adequately defend itself. This isn't like it's perfect, right? But can adequately defend itself against all advanced application security vulnerabilities and shows principles of good security design. Okay, so now we have a basic framework for this. So we can improve this. So what we're going to build upon this framework, this ASVS framework, and improve this. When we talk about threat management, again, level 0, I'm not really going to concentrate on. That's just, okay, organizations really probably aren't doing anything about it. So let's get into the meat of what we can now utilize, because I assume everybody here who's at a security conference probably is not ignoring the security for your organization, right? So level 1 ASVS, opportunistic. The organization can adequately defend itself against non-targeted threats that are easy to discover. Okay, so what does that actually mean? And this is where now we can begin to put together a framework of, again, tests that you need to ask yourself and validate and verify that would then put you into this level, or even furthering, into level 2 and level 3, right? So where I came up with what I felt a good level 1 set of tests for threat management would fall looks like this. There's no dedicated InfoSec or risk group, okay? Just, it isn't, you know, it's probably, let's say, a one-man shop, right? There's no dedicated security, you know, individuals. There's reliance on rudimentary alerts that are coming from your standard defense and depth controls. There's a process in place for handling malware-infected systems, okay? Typically, that's going to be probably looking like a help desk that's, you know, going to re-image systems or whatever. Centralized logging capabilities, but no correlation, so maybe some syslog, you know, centralized syslog, etc. Some of the tools are going to be there, but there's not really going to be much else going on, right? Sporadic additional, quote, threat intelligence, right, so SANS alerts, etc. There may be an associated vulnerability, a level 1 vulnerability management, you know, that may have an open source or even a commercial scanning tool, right? But, you know, going back to what I said, your threat management and your vulnerability management processes need to grow with each other and mature collectively, you know, together. And then the organization is probably comfortable with the NIST/ISO or whatever regulatory HIPAA, PCI type compliance. If they feel that if they're compliant within those types of frameworks, that we're doing our job. That's what I would consider level 1, you know, threat management applied to the ASVS. So let's talk about level 2, because in my opinion, that's probably not good enough for most people in this, you know, in this room. Level 2 is probably where most organizations who aren't in, let's say, critical infrastructure or are responsible for human lives being at stake. Level 2 is probably where most organizations should really kind of target for their threat management process, right? So the the overarching kind of description of level 2 applied to threat management, right? The organization can adequately defend itself against prevalent threats of moderate to serious capability. Such threats could include hacktivists and non-targeting organized crime actors. The majority of business organizations should work for this level, towards this level, right? So, all right, that's neat. What does it look like? And so here's where we start seeing dedicated risk and InfoSec groups, right, including a dedicated monitoring resource. Now we're starting to get into some of the, you know, we're delineating stuff down, you know, from threat management into its kind of like associated areas of focus, right? So we're talking about monitoring at this point. Integration with the existing level 2 vulnerability management process, basic monitoring framework and SIM deployment, documented incident response framework, pen, red, purple testing, simulating threat actors using real-world tactics. Okay, that's also very important. The InfoSec group itself may utilize an enterprise ticketing system for documenting tickets. That tends to be more critical for the vulnerability management process than the threat management process, but it's still good practice, right? And then the last one on this page is, you know, some open source / internal / commercial, I don't care what it is, right? But some level of actual threat intelligence. Additionally, we're going to take a look at a standard for reviewing intelligence that defines escalation processes. Commercial open source tools used for the actual logging and SIM, asset and data classification. You need to have asset and data classification down to a T before you can even consider the next one, which is role-based access control standards based on said classifications. We need to define the types of data and the types of assets before we can then say, you're not allowed to touch that type of data because it's not within your need, right? A threat modeling standard. Now we're starting to get into some of the fun stuff. Advanced endpoint controls. How many people actually use Emmet? One, two, like a handful.
Yeah,
What's wrong with you people? Oh, gosh, I'm forget. I'm following the Linux. I'm following the Linux talk. I'm sorry.
Breaks Microsoft Office regularly.
Yeah. 5.5. It's less than.
I actually installed it after the last talk I heard you.
Yeah.
Based improvement.
So sorry about that.
We use it in RIT.
How's it working for you?
5.5 is much better.
Okay. Yeah.
We had a lot of issues with that.
I totally agree with you guys in the back, right? But again, in a perfect world, that would be it's free and it's looking at behavioral anomalies and it's like, oh, work with your own applications, please. Okay, so kind of following up on this, right? Corporate cloud adoption standards. What is and what is. Not what is allowed and what's not allowed from a cloud perspective. We need to know this because this all has to tie into the actual threat management process itself. Third-party risk assessments. One final thing is encrypt your shit, right? It still kind of boggles my mind that organizations are spending millions and millions of dollars on DLP. And they're not encrypting stuff. I see this all the time. Start with encryption. I get that. Sure, we don't want to let emails go out unencrypted that contain social security numbers, but just encrypt, please. Okay, so that's kind of like my feeling around what a level 2. Yes, sir.
Encrypt with what?
So okay. Yeah. So I don't have the silver bullet there, right? I don't think anybody does. This again, I'm not really going to try to suggest the specifics. Yeah, but once you have the framework in place, the next step is figuring out what's not going to break your shit. So all right, now let's talk about level 3. This indicates that the organization can adequately defend itself against all advanced threats and show principles of good security design. This is appropriate for critical, that's actually, for organizations that deal with critical infrastructure, protect life, etc. Protect life. Think of things in terms of replaceability, right? Data replaceability. I think Josh Corman, I think Corman was the first person I heard talk about it in relation to this. Has anybody had a credit card stolen? What happened? Thank you. It's replaceable data. Got replaced, right? When you start talking about intellectual property, the 11 herbs and spices of Kentucky Fried Chicken, if that got stolen and now that represents, competition, potentially, undercutting price. There's stock valuation that's going to be associated with all that. That's a big impact to a potential, that's a potential big impact to a business, right? Electric cars, right? Electric cars are computers with wheels. Do we have any red teamers in here? Right? Can you not wait till you get your Tesla so you can just start screwing with it? Right? But what's the potential ramification there, right? That's human life. Bluetooth pacemakers with Bluetooth connections. Are you kidding me? But, replaceable data, irreplaceable data. And when we're dealing with organizations that are really fundamentally, protecting irreplaceable data, now we got to start thinking about this level 3, right? So, what does this potentially look like? All right, so we're going to start with threat prioritization standard, right? The way we've broken this down is in a kind of like a 3-phased approach, right? So there's a triage, which is mostly help desk type activities. What we call suspect, which is then the Security Operations Center investigation phase, that's been escalated up. And then now we've got incident, right? The third one is full-on incident. That incident then has to have a mature framework which includes buy-in and participation from all business units, including and probably especially legal and ethics, right? Because at an enterprise level, legal and ethics, they need to pretty much kind of, to a degree, QB how the organization is going to handle, let's say, an insider threat, right? Tabletop exercises, right? This is where the red / purple / whatever you want to call it. This is where what are historically considered the attacking teams. This is how they really can begin contributing to the blue team defensive kind of capabilities, right? So simulating domain breaches, which means in this exercise, full-on out-of-band communications, right? So I know a lot of organizations that when this lever is pulled and we realize that this is a serious incident, all communications go to like Google, right? Because you can't trust your own infrastructure. Phishing high-value target, right? So that could be the guy that actually has access to the secret sauce, etc., things of that nature. Simulated ransomware. This is becoming a big hot topic, obviously, as ransomware matures and is really going to be moving into the server space, right? The worm server space, etc. That's going to be yes.
It's already there, Samsung.
Yeah, no, I mean I don't disagree at all. Yes, it is there, but it's like now we're seeing just the beginning of the world. That's a domino, and this is going to get really fun. And then simulating that malicious insider. All incident response, internal incident response contact management system where all this stuff can be tracked. We need to know communications rhythm, who needs to be contacted, at what level of incident, right, and how often those people need to be updated with the updates on the actual incident process itself. IR honeypot and data gathering tools. Does anybody know what DSET is? Oh. For a Windows environment, look at DSET. Does anybody know what Mimikatz is? Okay, right. So Mimikatz, the greatest red team tool ever, right? Can go onto a host, and depending on the version of Windows, can scrape clear text credentials out of the LSAS process, and scrape the actual hashes, the password hashes from people who have logged onto these systems. Okay. That's pretty much game over in most organizations, that don't really have maybe, let's say, a level 3 incident response, within their threat management. So what DSET is, I love this. The guys at Dell SecureWorks, they just released this like a month and a half ago. It's basically a honey hash. I saw your face. So it's a client-server architecture where on a daily basis, every single host on your enterprise, there's a little agent, right? And every day a random 30-character password is injected into the LSAS process. That random password hash is associated with that asset. So now within your SIM, you're looking for, and there's a separate sniffing process that has to be on the same network or span port as the actual domain controllers. And when that sniffing process sees somebody trying to use what to them as an attacker looks like a domain admin hash, it completely alerts you to exactly what host that just came from. So now you can shut it down. It's really cool. Yes?
Yeah, so we've done some investigations where honey hashes have been implemented in cases where cache logon credentials are necessary for applications to function.
Yeah.
I've actually seen hashes popped off a stack which needed to be there, and so for some architecture, that solution is going to be very challenging to implement without breaking those applications, and you're kind of dependent on a third party to update that. So that might be a deal breaker.
So this probably resonates to the guy in the back who last year I said you should look into Emmett. But yeah, I mean, conceptually, on paper, it's really cool.
What was the name of that tool again?
It's right here, DSET.
Okay.
The other two that I've listed here, Kansa is a spectacular PowerShell-based incident response framework. Right? It utilizes PowerShell remoting. So in the enterprise space, you know, it's probably not the best business decision to just have PowerShell remoting enabled on all of your, you know, all of your systems without some type of control. So the way we've kind of architected solutions around Kansa is, you know, essentially some type of proxy, you know, that is IP limited or some type of, you know, some limitation into, and pushing out the actual controls to restrict who can PowerShell remote into these hosts. And it's only for, you know, for you know, lack of, just, you know, the actual simple example, it's only the box that is running the Kansa PowerShell scripts itself, right? So, it's interesting stuff. It's really, really interesting. All right, moving on. So, process creation auditing. We had a really interesting blue team guy come in from Fortune 4, and he was talking about, you know, here within the Windows event logs are some specific things that you should be monitoring for, because, and again, you know, it's kind of like analyze your situation appropriately, but that guy turns out to be a really good indicator in a lot of environments of, you know, something that probably shouldn't be here, spawning interesting and weird stuff. DLP and rights management, I don't care. It can be homegrown, defined by the data classification, etc. Enforceable identity access controls, right? So this is a big problem with a lot of organizations that we run into. You know, and typically we see the pen tests come in, plug something into the wall in an open Ethernet port in some conference room, and then within 8 hours, the domain controllers are knocked over. So some type of, you know, system, and again, you know, we're talking level 3, so the majority of this stuff is not going to be cheap. It's just the reality of it, most of it. And finally, for level 3, network identity access controls. Documented threat multipliers. You need to understand what the threat multipliers are going to be in your threat prioritization framework. Okay. Adversary capabilities assessment, or adversary ROI. Okay. Now we are starting to get into the part, the portion of threat management where we need to understand who might be incentivized to steal our stuff, and what are their capabilities. Right. Now, like a lot of qualitative risk assessment, that can tend to get voodoo-ish, right? But it's still a really good exercise to kind of go through and understand. I think at the end of the day, the goal really needs to be, you know, having some semblance of an understanding of who wants to steal our stuff and what their capabilities are, because we want to make sure that in our enterprise security architecture, when we're designing and deploying these types of controls over time, their intent really is to drive the adversary return on investment to 0, right? Make them spend too much time and too much money.
I was wondering, how would that work with a large corporation that needs to deal with a small corporation that has, or a small company even, that has a perceived to be mission critical application?
That's third party. As far as I'm concerned, you hear third party risk management a lot, but when we get into, let's say, here's an acquisition and it's now part of the organization.
No, I mean like an outside company even that's a vendor for a particular product that you say.
Oh, well, that's then absolutely part of the third party risk management. You know, and you know, I'm not going to go back in the slide deck, but you know, the 3 pillars of the enterprise security architecture is risk management, policy standards, and then design architecture, right? That falls under risk management, straight and forward, right? Okay. There's an association to threat management, even to vulnerability management, right? Because you need to have an understanding of where that organization sits, and are they sitting in a manner that is acceptable for your business, But it's all, realistically, that's all third-party risk management, absolutely. Periodic threat matrix exercises, etc., and then stakeholder service and owner reporting, again, going back to the whole metrics, right? But now we're talking about metrics, okay? So let's talk about metrics in relation to threat management itself. We want to talk about incident metrics that can include the characteristics of that type of incident, target system characteristics, the timeline of an incident, number of systems targeted, attack metrics, what's the vector, right? What's the sophistication? Was this just a ransomware? Was this some ODA? Attack profile characteristics, obfuscation techniques, right? Were they trying to really hide their tracks, etc.? Data metrics. What was the data targeted? What was the data compromised? Was any data exfiltrated, right? We begin building these metrics around threat management, and now we really can, I think, twofold. We really begin to have a model where we can begin gauging our own improvement over time, because a lot of this stuff can be simulated by red and purple teams, right? But then we also now have the ability to, like I said earlier, the importance of, through metrics, being able to communicate back up into the business, right? They don't necessarily need to know that whatever, polymorphic encryption was used on this particular attack, but we need to at least have some type of metric around those types of attacks and what they were targeting and how they, were able to succeed, etc. The threats by status really kind of ties into your enterprise ticketing system, right? So all the stats around open and active, etc. Tickets around the threat management, typically incidents. And then a couple of my favorites: mean time to compromise and cost to disrupt. These are really, really fun metrics if you can get to the point within the program, within the maturity of the threat management program, to begin deriving these guys, right? So mean time to compromise, again, you can simulate a lot of that stuff through red and purple team testing. Working with an organization that, we know that crown jewels may exist on these types of systems or domain controllers or what have you. So based on the existing controls, the existing, detection and response capabilities, what is the mean time to compromise these types of systems, right? And now can we begin showing improvement over time? And then cost to disrupt, right? This is directly in relation to, that adversary ROI. How much is it going to cost the adversary to get to the point where that compromise succeeds, right? The cost to disrupt. Okay, so that's really kind of the high-level application of threat management within the ASVS framework that I kind of came up with, right? What I'm going to do is make this all up on GitHub and make it all community-based and all that stuff. You can contribute whatever you want. A couple slides here. I want to talk briefly about threat modeling. There's a couple of different ways. Again, I'm not going to sit here and say this is the way to do it, but here's a couple of ways that I've seen work very well. This is the 3 tenets threat model. The paper here, and I'll make all this available, but the paper here, quantitative metrics and risk assessment, the 3 tenet model of cybersecurity. It's an excellent, excellent paper. All right, so take a look at that. They really kind of go into, they're not just kind of, being a talking head like me. They're going into some really gnarly risk math and calculations, but it's really good. And this came from that paper that the application of that 3 tenets model I've seen work very well from a threat modeling perspective. But my personal favorite is this from Bruce Potter, his DerbyCon 4 talk, Threat Modeling for Reals. You can't get more straightforward than this, right? So here's the threat model that you need to understand, the variables, right? Actor does action to asset, resulting in outcome because of motivation. It's beautiful. What I'm going to do now is and it's not really a demo, the way like, you know, I'm not writing code and it's and I'm worried that it's not going to fail. The only way that this is going to fail is if Emmett fucks up Excel. So, but I'm going to give you a little taste of some of the things that we've been working on. Okay, so this is our threat prioritization matrix. So we're starting with input, right? And in this example, this is our defense in depth, a lot of our defense in depth portion of our enterprise security architecture. We're working with our SIM. Here's our data inputs. Visual. I'm going to unfortunately name names here. I'm not promoting any of them. This just happens to be one of the ones that we liked, right? This first guy here is removable access controls. Cognitive threat analytics is actually a weird kind of byproduct of a Cisco acquisition. You would actually have to search for it in order to look, if you don't know what it is, but it's not something that they actually kind of sell, but it's really, really interesting in terms of threat analytics. Cisco, I will say, is the one organization that, with the Talos, does anybody know what Talos is? All right. Talos is really interesting because that is basically tying every single Cisco security device to a degree into a centralized global threat database, right? They have analysts that are, something gets found that may represent a threat to an organization, and there's the ability for that information to then get redistributed out to all of their Cisco devices. And there's a lot of those out there. It's kind of interesting. So IPS, AMP, AV, Sky High is a cloud thing, CWS, etc. Anyway, the point here is that once we have an understanding of, once we have a good set of inputs, we can begin looking at things like, okay, what type of malware are we dealing with? Is it a backdoor, right? And so our threshold for these first, right? So malware type, volume, corp ID. Now this corp ID is really kind of getting to, all right, how important are you within the organization? Right, so I can call this I can call a few PowerShell commands and get an idea of what groups you are, within Active Directory, and now I can associate those groups with what should be an existing critical asset or critical function, services and functions within the organization. If your groups that you are a member of tie into, let's say, the top 10 critical services within the business, that's going to be a threat multiplier, right? Service level, etc. So what we've done here, our thresholds, and I'll kind of bump this up here. I'll make that a big boy. Oops, wrong one. This guy. Right, so our threshold in this particular little spreadsheet was 13, and anything above 13 we want to escalate. So now that particular thing gets escalated to the SOC team. The SOC team is now taking a look at things that you may or may not have actual access to. You may not understand, like, who, what's the origin, what is the intent of this potential threat, right? So those then we consider threat multipliers. If you know that that's going to affect the overarching threat result, the scoring here, so to speak. But at the end of the day, and I'll kind of muck with this a little bit here, you can see that here, okay, we've got our rating, we've got our description, response, accountability, who to notify, communications rhythm, and post-report. If I drop this down to something that's not as serious, all that stuff's going to change, and now we kind of have a rough idea of what our threat reaction, or the reaction should be in relation to some type of threat within the organization. Now again, that's something that we just put together for a specific a specific client of ours, and it works for them. All of this can be completely, modulated, modified, etc., to fit your needs. The other one that I want to take a look at is, this is really where I think some of the value of applying this to the ASVS is going to come through. The ASVS actually provides, you can just download this actual spreadsheet, all right? So this spreadsheet then, you can see, does this first thing, which is verify all pages and resource require authentication except those specifically intended to be whatever. All right. It shows you, is that a requirement for level 1? Is that a requirement for level 2? Is that a requirement for level 3? Right? And it's, you can go down throughout the entire ASVS set of requirements and begin, and again, this is where the gray line between an audit and something more, sophisticated that has more teeth. This has teeth, okay? And so now we can really begin saying, okay, it's not about necessarily are you scanning, the example is, are you scanning for vulnerabilities? It's how mature your vulnerability management program is, right? And so what I've begun to do is apply this over to threat management. So kind of come over here a little bit. Right, so a lot of the stuff that I've talked about now, I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna do the same thing for vulnerability management, and I'm gonna make all this, public open source, and you can contribute in GitHub and all that. But I think at this point now we have a much more manageable framework that does have teeth, that you can kind of say, okay, my goal is to at least get to level 2 from a threat management perspective. And where do I lack? What do I need to focus on? Right? Does that make sense? All right. Back to this. Of course. Okay. So what is next? I think in relation to the actual set of processes within the enterprise security architecture, the ASVS is the SDLC process. Okay, that's what it was originally intended to do. I did that last year, applied this to vulnerability management, and now this is the ASVS applied to threat management. Again, all this is going to get open source, but I think the next step logically is identity management. And so, with all that kind of set up, public, I think that I believe, and I really kind of hope that this kind of testing with these types of frameworks to understand the maturity of these processes is a much more important and much more successful way to really kind of begin measuring more of the objective security in a way that isn't, you're not actually getting like super, knee deep into the weeds, but also, it's not a compliance audit, right? So that's pretty much, that's what I got, guys. So we've got a few minutes. Are there any questions?
Can you put your slides up? I missed that.
I'm sorry?
Can we get to your slides on the internet or something?
I'll put them up on SlideShare. Yeah. I'll let the Rochester organizers know. Yes, sir.
You keep saying information, right? So you would also throw assets, say robotic surgery device, right? Assets,
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. My lexicon was probably very information specific, but at the end of the day, right, one of the most critical components here is understanding what are the critical assets that support your business critical data, right? And then who has access to that and all that. And, yeah, but absolutely, yes. Yeah. Yep. Thank you. Questions, comments? Am I completely off my rocker?
Not yet.
Not yet. I'm looking forward to it.
Looking forward to the GitHub project.
All right, if there's no questions, then thank you. Appreciate it.